Hi, I wanted to take a few minutes to look and dig in a little deeper on the question of whether God is more persuasive or coercive, which is an assignment in the Foundations Integration part of the leadership course. In some ways, as I think probably the discussion has made it clear, the way it looks on the outside may not differ that much depending on which perspective you have. So, for example, there is a perspective on God's coerciveness that would say it's called soft determinism. There is a perspective that would say that while we experience our lives as free, we feel like we're free, that actually God is behind the scenes, I would say manipulating what we do. That may not sound like the feel that perspective wants to give, but to me that's pretty much what it is. We're saying that actually God is determining everything behind the scenes. Everything I do, God is determining. I just feel like I'm free. That's called soft determinism. Roger Olson at Baylor has suggested that this is a distinction without a difference. So I'm not sure that there really is that big of a deal between hard determinism or soft determinism, other than the fact that soft determinism sounds better. Soft determinism at least acknowledges that I think I'm free, that I think that I decided to make this video even though I really didn't, even though it was determined that I would make this video. So I would agree with Olson that there really is no meaningful distinction between hard and soft determinism, other than that the soft determinist language accepts that we at least perceive ourselves to be free, even though we're not. But you can see that whether I'm actually free or whether I just think I'm free, I experience myself as being free. And so in that respect, sometimes in this conversation, the discussions of whether I actually am or not can become somewhat theoretical, because in my real life, I'm just acting like I'm free. We all have to act as if we're free, whether we are or not, if that makes any sense. So on the one end of the spectrum, and I realize that you've read Dr. Bounds' way of setting it out. This is not in any way contradictory to that, but the Wesleyan position, for those of you who are interested, is one of that is technically is one of empowered free will. Now, we are so used to talking about free will that Wesleyans a lot of times just assume that the Wesleyan position is to believe in completely unadulterated free will, that I can decide in my own power. That technically is not the Wesleyan position. The Wesleyan position is that the freedom of will that I have is brought on by God's grace, by God's power. Now, that's sometimes called prevenient grace in the Wesleyan tradition, that God's grace has gone before, prevenient to come before. God's grace has come before I even knew it and has empowered me to move toward God. It is me moving toward God in the Wesleyan position. It is my free choice, but it is a choice that is empowered by God's grace that has powered me up, so to speak, that in my own power I could not make any choice or movement toward God. God has charged my batteries a little bit so that I can do it. So that it is initiated by God's grace, but it is a grace that leads to free choice to some degree. Not an absolute freedom, but some freedom that God gives me the power to do. Now, in the 16th century, a position called this term did not exist until the 1500s. In the 16th century, a position known as semi-Pelagianism was condemned. This is not the Wesleyan position either. Semi-Pelagianism, as I understand it, is the idea that we are free to initiate our movement toward God, but then it is only God's grace that can move us forward from that point. This is, again, the opposite of Wesley's position. For Wesley, it is grace that initiates our ability to then make free movement. Whereas a semi-Pelagian would say, if I understand it correctly, that it starts with freedom and then goes to grace. So Wesleyans are not properly known as semi-Pelagians. Technically, Wesleyans believe in total depravity, but that by God's grace we are empowered to make some movement toward God in what's called a synergistic way. Our will working with God's will, but it is God's power that underlies that ability. Pelagianism, of course, is the idea that we're just flat out free, and this was condemned by the Council of Orange in, I think, the 500s, and so that has long been considered a heresy within the church. Of course, for many who are listening to this distinction, you're more interested in what the Bible might say than what various people in church history have had to say. But of course, all the people who've taken these positions, whether it be the hard determinists, the soft determinists, Calvin arguably was a soft determinist, or whether it be Wesley, or whether it be Molina, who was sometimes considered a semi-Pelagian, or whether it be Pelagius himself in the days of Augustine in the 400s, that these people all thought that they were interpreting Scripture. And so it's not that these church historical figures are somehow different from the debate over the meaning of Scripture. They were all trying to find a coherent view within Scripture. And this might be a good time to stop and think about what a biblical theology is. Throughout the seminary program, you will be facing this question of what is a biblical theology. And we're you're fairly early on in your seminary, and fairly early in the leadership course if you are watching this video. And so I want to go ahead and put in an early plug for what at least I'm thinking of when I talk about finding a biblical theology. We sing that song, "The Bible tells me so." That's what we're looking for when we identify a biblical, we discern a biblical theology on an issue. And I want to go ahead and put in a plug here for what I think a well-done biblical theology, some of the characteristics. One of them is that coming up with a good biblical theology is not just a matter of coming up with a trump verse. So biblical theology is not about finding one verse on every question. That's not a good biblical theology, in my opinion. In fact, and this is a little subtle, what I'm going to say next, I hope that you will fully understand the nuance here by the time you get through the program. But a biblical theology, a good biblical theology, in my opinion, is not just a matter of adding up individual verses. Even if you have paid attention to what those verses are saying in a literary context. A good biblical theology has to step back from individual verses and see the whole map, be able to map the whole issue in the light of the whole Scripture. It's not a matter of just adding up verses. So, yes, you can find verses that sound like God sends demons on people. Yes, I mean, they're there. You can find verses in 2 Samuel, I think it is, where it says God sends an evil spirit on Saul. And so you can find an individual verse that sounds like God sends demons on people. But in the light of the whole of Scripture, and looking at the flow of revelation, the way God has walked with His people and has helped them understand. So arguably, the earlier parts of the Bible have a less precise understanding of some things than the New Testament does. So, for example, the demons of the New Testament are the gods of the Old Testament. There's a kind of lights coming on, even on resurrection. The New Testament has a far more robust understanding of resurrection than the Old Testament does. So it's not just a matter of finding individual verses or a collection of individual verses. If you want to have a truly profound biblical theology, you're going to have to step back from individual texts and begin to think in terms of the character of God. Find an overall coherent theological vantage point on the whole of Scripture that keeps in mind the character of God, that keeps in mind what is sometimes known as the rule of faith. These are certain basics about God that the earliest Christians identified from Scripture. Again, they weren't just coming out with something in addition to Scripture. They discerned these features of Scripture, the idea that God is the Creator, the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin. The virgin birth doesn't have a lot of play in the actual text of Scripture, 2 chapters, but it's an important doctrine from the standpoint of biblical theology. The law of love. Jesus tells us that the law is summed up in love, and so you just cannot have a good biblical theology that endorses hatred of any kind on people, because Jesus has given us the center point on that. So these are some of the characteristics of a good biblical theology. And so when it comes to the question of God's persuasiveness or coerciveness, there are competing claims among theological traditions. So some theological traditions tend to see justice as the more primary of God's characteristics, whereas the Wesleyan tradition would see God's love as the more primary attribute or characteristics of Him. And what we think about these things has an effect on how we think we live. It has an effect on politics. And I just want to end this little introduction to this topic by mentioning a Baylor Religion Survey that was conducted by Baylor University in 2006. It found, curiously, that different parts of the country tend to have different perspectives on what God is like. So, for example, this survey found that 43% of those who live in the South tend to have an authoritarian view of God. This is the idea of a God who is high on the wrath scale and who is high on the involvement in the world scale. This is going to affect, this is, I would argue, more appropriate for a Calvinist perspective and a justice as the ultimate characteristics of God than, for example, a Wesleyan Arminian perspective of God. 28.8% of those in the Midwest had a more benevolent view of God. The more benevolent view tends to be lower on the wrath scale, but still very high in God's involvement in the world. By the way, authoritarian was still beat out the benevolent view in the Midwest, but the benevolent view was far more prominent than it was, say, in the South. Similarly, the critical view of God was almost on an even keel with authoritarian and benevolent in the East. Here we're talking about, New England and those sorts of places. So the critical view of God has a low involvement in the world, but a high wrath kind of perspective. So God, it's not that He is dispensing His wrath that much in the world, but He's stewing about it. He's angry at you. He's sitting there in disapproval of you, even though He's not punishing you. And then, interestingly enough, 30.3% of those in the West had a distant view of God. This was of all the regions of the United States, the West was the one that had the highest view of God as distant. I wonder if this has something to do with the fact that the West was the late frontier. The Midwest, of course, was the early frontier, but it had revivals. There were lots of revivals in the Midwest in its frontierdom, whereas the far West did not experience the revivals in its frontier days as the Midwest did. So, why am I sharing this? Because how you view God affects the way you apply Scripture. It affects the way that you view politics. So, for example, the political dynamics of these regions of the United States correspond to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree, with their view of God. And so having a good view of God, or an appropriate view of God, will play its way out in how we raise our children. It'll play out in how we vote, and these things are very significant. So from a Wesleyan perspective, God is a God of love, more benevolent view of God. This is going to, I think, going to affect our politics. In particular, I think it means that on matters of harming others, when it comes to harming others, probably the Wesleyan view is going to be one to want to protect those who are going to be harmed. There are any number of issues where I think Wesleyans will want to see the nation and the national laws protect the innocent, protect those who are vulnerable. By the same token, You would expect a Wesleyan Arminian perspective to be more libertarian when it comes to non-essential issues. That is, when it's not a matter of protecting someone, that you would expect somebody who has a more free view of God to endorse a more free will, even a free will to disobey. This is an interesting question. Would a Calvinist be more likely to want to see the laws of God enforced on everybody, to make sure that no wrongdoer is able to do wrong in terms of moral belief? Whereas would a Wesleyan basically say God has given them up to be sinners? God allows people to be sinners. There'll be a final judgment, but God allows people in the meantime to make bad choices, especially if they're not hurting others. These are good things to think about in terms of the way that we apply our theology or have a coherent and consistent theology. Well, some things to think about in relation to God as either more persuasive or more coercive.